Hours that rewrote the rules of engagement, hours that shattered assumptions held since the war began, hours that forced every capital from Washington to Moscow to recalculate what comes next. What Russia did last night crossed a line that NATO had hoped would hold. A line that Western governments had drawn not in public statements, but in quiet diplomatic channels, in classified briefings, in the kind of backroom negotiations that never make headlines. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with precision, with fury, and with a level of coordination that caught even their closest allies by surprise. This was not a routine exchange of fire. This was not another day in a grinding war of attrition. This was something different. This was the night everything changed. And if you're just joining us, if you're trying to understand what happened over Kyiv while most of the world slept, stay with me, because what I'm about to tell you is already reshaping the decisions being made in the Pentagon, in Downing Street, in Brussels, and yes, in the Kremlin itself. Section B, background tension. For weeks now, there had been signals, not official statements, not press releases, just signals that Russia was preparing something unprecedented. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been predictable in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a doctrine. Strike civilian infrastructure when ground forces stall. Launch missile barrages when Western aid packages are announced. Test air defenses before major offensives. The playbook has been brutal, but it has been readable. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military activity know the indicators: the repositioning of strategic bomber squadrons, the unusual silence in encrypted military communications, the movement of specialized munitions from storage facilities deep inside Russia, the sudden recall of senior commanders from field positions. All of that went quiet. And whenever Russia goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Ukrainian intelligence noticed first. They flagged unusual activity at 3 separate Russian air bases, Mozdok, Engels, and Olenya, that had not seen this level of coordination since the opening weeks of the invasion. American satellites confirmed what Ukrainian sources were reporting. British signals intelligence picked up fragments of encrypted communications that suggested a major operation was being planned. French military attachés in Kyiv began advising personnel to avoid certain areas of the capital. Everyone knew something was coming. No one knew exactly what. Until last night. Section C. The revelation. Early Tuesday morning, at approximately 2:47 a.m. Kyiv time, U.S. Space Command detected what they described as a massive coordinated launch sequence, including the activation of strategic aviation assets that had not been deployed in active combat operations in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: escalation, desperation, or a fundamental shift in strategic posture. Western observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its approach. And when a nuclear-armed state shifts its military posture without explanation, even by small measures, every intelligence agency on the planet pays attention. Within minutes of the initial detection, NORAD was briefed. NATO's Supreme Allied Commander Europe was awakened. The White House Situation Room began filling with staff. And in Kyiv, air raid sirens that had become almost routine took on a different sound, a different meaning. What came next would prove that the fears were justified. Between 3:15 a.m. and 4:42 a.m. local time, Russia launched what Ukrainian officials are now calling the single most intensive aerial assault on Kyiv since the war began. The attack included 37 cruise missiles, including 12 Kh-101 air-launched cruise missiles, 8 caliber sea-launched variants, and 17 Iskander ballistic missiles fired from positions inside Belarus. But that wasn't what made this attack different. What made this attack different was the payload. Section D, the warning response. The warning issued by the United States government tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Senior official after National Security Council meeting described Russia's move as provocative, as dangerous, and perhaps most importantly, as indicative of a willingness to cross thresholds previously considered inviolable. Russia had deployed what appears to be a new variant of hypersonic weapon, one that Western intelligence had tracked in development but had not expected to see in operational use for at least another 6 to 9 months. The intent, according to sources speaking with multiple news outlets, was to overwhelm Kyiv's air defense network in a single, devastating blow, to prove that no amount of Western technology could protect Ukraine's capital, to break the will of a population that has endured 2 years of constant bombardment. But psychological warfare only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response last night was among the most sophisticated, most coordinated, and most devastating we've seen in the entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 47 minutes of the first Russian launch detection, Ukrainian forces initiated a counterstrike operation that military analysts are already calling unprecedented. These weren't the retrofitted Soviet-era drones we've seen in previous operations. These were advanced Western-provided systems, Attack-MS missiles, Storm Shadow cruise missiles, and what appears to be a new generation of Ukrainian-developed long-range strike drones, systems that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally reshape the battlefield. Section E, Detailed Breakdown. Tonight, the Ukrainian General Staff confirmed that Ukrainian forces launched coordinated strikes on 14 separate targets deep inside Russian-occupied territory and Russia itself, including an ammunition depot in Crimea that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was preparation for a spring offensive Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate its gains. They hit fuel storage facilities in occupied Luhansk. They hit command and control nodes in Donetsk that coordinated the night's attack. They hit logistics hubs in Crimea that were likely preparing to support a renewed push toward Zaporizhzhia. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's offensive capability, the infrastructure that would have made continued large-scale attacks sustainable. This is what made the Pentagon's warning so urgent. Russia's attack wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of escalation that could destabilize the entire theater if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike population centers. They didn't target civilian infrastructure. They hit military logistics. They hit command structures. They hit the machinery of war itself. And in doing so, they sent a message that reverberated from Moscow to Washington. Ukraine is not just surviving this war. Ukraine is fighting to win it. Section F. Deeper analysis. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Western intelligence officials now believe that Russia's latest attack was designed to test the resilience of Western support after months of congressional delays in American military aid. Russia wanted to see whether Ukraine would flinch, whether NATO would waver, whether the cracks in Western unity would finally break open. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't hesitate. They launched a counteroffensive response that was so rapid, so precise, that even Russian military commanders noticed. You don't get the Kremlin's attention easily, but last night, Ukraine did. Defense analysts speaking with Reuters under anonymity described Russia's attack as a strategic probe, a way to gauge whether the political chaos in Washington had translated into operational weakness on the ground. But Ukraine proved last night that they remain both capable and connected. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were coordinated so precisely that multiple targets across a 1,000-kilometer front were hit within the same 15-minute window. That level of synchronization matters because it shows something critical. It shows that Ukraine's intelligence integration with Western partners is not just intact, it's improving. It shows that Ukraine is not merely reacting to Russian aggression, they are anticipating it, they are preparing for it, and they are striking back before Russia can adjust. Section G, Scale and Scope. As reports continued coming in throughout the night and into this morning, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian Air Force units carried out suppression of enemy air defense operations, forcing Russian S-400 systems in Crimea to relocate or risk destruction. Ukrainian naval drones targeted a Russian frigate in the Black Sea that had been repositioned in the last 72 hours, suggesting pre-attack intelligence had tracked the vessel's movement. Ukrainian Special Operations Forces operating behind Russian lines reportedly disabled a rail junction used by Russia to transport ammunition from storage depots in the Urals. This wasn't just a defensive response, this wasn't just a proportional retaliation, this was strategic initiative, this was operational tempo, and operational tempo is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the failed Kyiv offensive in the war's opening months. For every advance they have made, In Bakhmut, in Avdiivka, in the grinding battles along the Eastern Front, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates Russian planning, disrupts Russian logistics, and forces Russian commanders to fight on multiple fronts simultaneously. Last night was not an exception. It was an escalation of that strategy. Section H, historical context. Remember, Russia thought this war would last 3 days. They thought Ukraine's government would collapse, that Zelensky would flee, that NATO would fracture under the pressure of energy costs and refugee flows. They thought the West would lose interest after a few months of headlines. They thought sanctions would hurt Europe more than Russia. They thought their military, the supposed second most powerful in the world, would simply overwhelm a country 1/3 their size. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine's military is more capable than it was 2 years ago. Western support, despite political turbulence, is holding, and Russia is the one scrambling to explain why their special military operation has become the longest, bloodiest, and most costly military engagement Russia has undertaken since World War II. Last night was supposed to change that narrative. It didn't. It reinforced the opposite. Section 1. Stakes and pressure. What makes this moment so volatile and so dangerous is that Russia's latest attack happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under extraordinary internal pressure. Military hardliners want escalation. They want tactical nuclear weapons deployed. They want total mobilization. They want a war footing that matches the rhetoric. Economic pragmatists want de-escalation. They want sanctions relief. They want to rebuild trade relationships with Europe. They want to stop the hemorrhaging of capital and talent fleeing Russia. Nationalist politicians want victory. Any victory, however defined, that they can sell to a domestic population increasingly skeptical of the war's progress. And regional governors want resources being drained by a military campaign that has cost Russia an estimated 200,000 casualties and hundreds of billions of dollars in equipment. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a war that has exposed every weakness in the Russian military-industrial complex. And when leaders in that position make sudden dramatic moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. Last night's attack was not a sign of Russian confidence. It was a sign of Russian desperation, and Ukraine's response proved that desperation will be met with consequences. Section J, official response. The Pentagon's assessment, now circulating among NATO allies, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Russian escalation to go unanswered. Defense Department officials said plainly that Russia's use of advanced hypersonic weapons in a coordinated strike on a civilian population center was inconsistent with international humanitarian law and destabilizing to regional security. That is diplomatic language for, we see what you're doing and we're not going to let it stand. You don't usually hear that tone from the Pentagon unless something serious is at stake. Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin has scheduled an emergency call with his NATO counterparts for tomorrow morning. National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan briefed congressional leadership from both parties within hours of the attack. And sources familiar with White House deliberations say discussions are already underway about accelerating weapons deliveries that had been scheduled for the coming months. The message is clear. Last night may have been Russia's escalation, but tomorrow may be America's. Section K. Leader's speech. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed his nation in a defiant, emotional speech tonight. He said, "They thought they could break us with one night of terror. They were wrong. They will always be wrong." He said, "Every missile they fire makes our resolve stronger. Every attack proves that we are the ones they fear." And he said, "To those who wonder if Ukraine can survive this war, look at what we did tonight. Look at how we responded. This is who we are. This is what we are fighting for." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leader who understands just how high the stakes have become, and who knows that the next few weeks may determine the trajectory of this war for years to come. Zelensky also thanked Ukraine's international partners, specifically naming the United States, United Kingdom, France, and Germany, while pointedly reminding them that support delayed is support denied. The message was unmistakable. Ukraine needs more weapons. Ukraine needs them now, and last night proved exactly why. Section L. Expanded threat. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's attack wasn't isolated. Along with the assault on Kyiv, Belarusian forces also conducted unusual military exercises along the Ukrainian border with troop movements that NATO analysts describe as provocative positioning. Iranian-supplied Shahed drones were launched in record numbers against Ukrainian energy infrastructure in the Kharkiv region. Chinese diplomatic channels increased pressure on European governments to block further arms transfers, with Beijing's foreign ministry issuing statements that many interpreted as implicit support for Russia's actions. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, military, diplomatic, and through its network of aligned states, it means something larger is underway. This was not a single attack. This was a coordinated campaign, and Ukraine's response last night was not just a reaction to one night of violence. It was a statement that coordinated aggression will be met with coordinated resistance. Section M. Possibilities. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing for a major spring offensive, and last night's attack was intended to degrade Ukrainian air defenses in advance of that push. Another is that Russia is attempting to force Ukraine to the negotiating table from a position of perceived strength, using escalation as a bargaining chip. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to provoke a response that could be characterized as escalation by Ukraine, creating a pretext for even more dramatic action. But last night, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't strike Russian territory indiscriminately. They didn't target civilian infrastructure. They didn't give Russia the propaganda victory it may have been seeking. They responded with military precision against military targets, and in doing so, they demonstrated that escalation by Russia will not change the fundamental dynamics of this war. Section N. The test. What we're watching now is a test of endurance. Russia wants to see if Ukraine's will can be broken through sustained, overwhelming violence. Ukraine wants to show that every escalation will be met with consequences Russia cannot afford. NATO wants to prevent this conflict from expanding beyond Ukraine's borders, and the rest of the world wants to prevent this war from becoming the catalyst for a broader global confrontation. Last night was a test of all of these things, and so far the results suggest that Ukraine and its partners are not backing down. Section O. Latest updates. Tonight we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now monitoring Russian military movements with heightened scrutiny. They say Russian forces are repositioning air defense assets, suggesting concern about further Ukrainian strikes. They say Russian military communications have increased dramatically in the hours since Ukraine's counterstrike, indicating confusion and possibly damage assessment. And they say Russia's decision to deploy experimental hypersonic weapons is likely part of a broader strategy intended to test Western red lines before a potential spring offensive. But Ukraine is not retreating. In fact, Ukraine is pressing its advantage. Their response last night, decisive, coordinated, and devastating, sent a message to Russia that escalation will be matched, and it sent a message to NATO that Ukraine remains a capable, reliable partner in this fight. Section P. Closing. As the hours go on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with last night's attack. But what we do know is that Ukraine's response was timely. It disrupted Russian operations before they could be reinforced. It demonstrated capabilities that Russia may have underestimated, and it proved once again that Ukraine is not simply defending its territory. It is actively contesting Russia's ability to wage this war. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 48 to 72 hours. If they de-escalate, this moment will be remembered as the night Ukraine proved its resilience. If they escalate further, Ukraine and its partners have already shown they are prepared to respond. They have shown they are ready to match Russia's aggression. They have shown they are ready to win. Section Q. Final hook. And tonight, for the first time in months, Moscow appears to be uncertain. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Russia is quiet after an operation of this scale, it means they are recalculating. It means they are assessing the damage, not just to their military assets, but to their strategic assumptions. It means they are choosing their next move very, very carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they have been forced to learn repeatedly throughout this war. Ukraine does not break. Ukraine fights back. And Ukraine has friends who are watching, supporting, and preparing to ensure that this war ends on Ukraine's terms, not Russia's. This story is far from over. The coming days will bring new developments, new decisions, new dangers. But tonight, one thing is clear. The game has changed. The lines have shifted. And whatever happens next, what happened over Kyiv last night will not be forgotten. We will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds. Stay with us.